Welcome, everyone. We will get started here in a couple seconds. Just want to give a minute for folks to trickle in. Thanks for being here. Okay. Thanks everybody for being here. My name is Cami Sacco and I am a climate programs manager at Second Nature. And today we're going to be talking about how to embed equity into your climate action planning. And I'll bring our panelists on here in just a couple minutes, but we're going to do a little housekeeping before we move into that. So first, just some logistics per usual. The program is being recorded. After the session, we'll send out a link, which it will include an evaluation link. Please fill that out. It's really helpful for us to understand if this landed with what you were looking for and what we were trying to convey. And then we'll also post it on YouTube. And if for folks that are here could introduce themselves in the chat so we understand a little bit more about who's in the room and your name and institution and just a little bit maybe about why you're here and what you're here to learn about. And then to ask questions, please use the Q&A function, but you're also welcome to put them in the chat. We'll have 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the presentations, but again, you're welcome to add them throughout the webinar, and then we'll also be bringing them in towards the end. I know we also for this one specifically had asked if folks had questions, and so we have that list and we'll be pulling off of those. And I know the panelists also use that to inform some of their presentations. So those are things that folks will try to talk about a little bit more throughout the session. So as I mentioned, this is part of our webinar series, specifically our climate action planning webinar series. And this is our third out of 12. We will finish them out right before the summit, which is February 2nd through the 4th in 2025 in higher education DC, or in Washington, DC. We're sending out, I think, our next three. We're sending them out in parts. So our next three will go out, I think, today, the announcement. And so be on the lookout for those. And yeah, more information is on our website. So I mentioned that we have our Higher Education Climate Leadership Summit that is taking place February 2nd through the 4th in Washington, D.C. And we have our call for content, which is open through September 27th. So if you have an idea around things you think should be talked about at the summit, please go to that website and you can find more details there. We have a couple working groups that we wanted to highlight. And this one I think is pretty relevant for this webinar specifically, and this is our Intersectional Climate Action Leaders Working Group. This is essentially a BIPOC affinity space for members and non-members of the Climate Leadership Network. And it's attended for MSI stakeholders and specifically, HBCUs, tribals, Hispanic serving institutions, but also community partners and NGO partners that are BIPOC identifying for folks to be able to learn more about what each other are doing and kind of how to move the work forward. So if you're interested in that, there's a QR code for you to be able to join, or you can contact Blythe at the email below. And then we also have our IRA Community of Practice, which is new and launching within the coming months. So if you're interested in that, please scan this QR code and we'll get back to you around details with that's coming up. So those are a couple of our working groups. And then we really wanted to start off, we've been starting off these webinars just with a little bit of a better understanding of, again, who's in the room and what you've done around the work. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll, and we'll keep it open just for a couple minutes, and then we'll share it with everyone so they can see, and I'll talk through it a little bit, so they can see kind of, again, who's here. So I'm going to go ahead and launch it, and I will close it here in a couple minutes. Okay, so I'm just going to share the results so everybody can see. Obviously, this is anonymous, so folks can't see who answered what. But we have a pretty even keel of where people are at in completing their climate action plan. So 22% have not started, 22 are in the beginning, 22% are in the middle, 11% are at the end, and 22% are currently updating. So that's good for the panelists to know kind of, again, who's in the room and where they're at in their process. Have you completed a climate action plan process? 37% have said yes, 63% have said no. So that's interesting to know that a lot of folks have not completed a process overall. And then lastly, we have how are you feeling about integrating equity into the process of completing your climate action plan? So most of y'all feel supported by your administration, which is great news, but don't know where to start. And I think that's a good place to be right now, because our panelists are going to talk a little bit about specifically about that. And then we do have, let's say, 4 people total, but 11% and 4%. 11% said, I do not feel supported by my administration and don't know where to start. And then one person said, I'm not supported to discuss equity on a state level, but still know it's important, but do not know where to start. So that's really helpful for us to, again, get an idea of where you're at within your orientation of the work. And yeah, our panelists can use that a little bit more. So I'll have our panelists come on camera and we'll do introductions. Hello. Hello. Okay. So today we have 3 amazing panelists, which I'm excited for them, again, to share their wisdom with us and kind of tell us how they've moved through the work of embedding equity, which I think all of us know is very important and ongoing throughout not only completing a climate action plan process, but after even you complete it and, you know, for forever, right? So our first panelist is Sophia Agturap, and she is with the Washington State Board of Technical and Community Colleges. And I'm just going to read her bio here. And then, Sophia, I'll let you take it away. And then Briar and Ileana, I'll pull you guys back on and do your introductions that way. But Sophia's with the Washington State Board of Technical and Community Colleges. And then we have Ileana Ortega Brunetti, who's with UC Santa Cruz. And then we have Briar Way, who's with Portland Community College. So Sophia is with the pronoun she, they, as a 1.5 generation Filipina American who values curiosity and wonder as she navigates through the world. She works alongside individuals and communities at the intersection of justice and equity, at the intersections of justice, equity, belonging, and climate justice, as we do the brave and hard work of imagining the world we want to build and animating others to create a more just society where we all may thrive, people, planet, and all living things. Sophia is the Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion with the Washington State Board of Community and Technical Colleges. She has a master's degree in teaching and in communication and digital media from the University of Washington and is working on her EDD in equity and education through the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And then she's also on the board of ASHE, which is the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Ed, on planning teams for the Washington, Oregon Higher Education Sustainability Conference, and the Climate Justice Working Group for the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity. She's a dabbler and likes to learn new things, and on a nice day, you can find her in her hammock in her backyard with a book. So, Sophia, I will hand it over to you, and just let me know when you want to move through and go to your next slide.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to share this space with you all. I should probably put it on the right screen. Okay, so just a little bit of context. I don't work on a college campus, so I work for the state board, and we are sort of a pass-through for legislative monies, but we have 34 community and technical colleges in our state system. So we're a little bit like a central office for state's community and technical colleges, which gives us an interesting sort of vantage point, like the 30,000-foot view, as well as kind of what's happening on the ground. And so I'm joining you all from Olympia, Washington, which is where our office is located. It's also the traditional homelands of the Nisqually, Cowlitz, and Squaxin Island peoples who have stewarded these lands since time immemorial. So we give gratitude and thanks for their stewardship and continued leadership and partnership in all things. So we're a governor appointed board. Again, we provide leadership for 34 community and technical colleges and serve about 273,000 students annually as they prepare for anything from workforce to different credentials, transfers to a four-year university, and to gain math and English skills as they continue to pursue education even beyond our community and technical college system. Next slide, please. Okay, so our office is fairly new within this context. We are the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and part of our charge is really to uphold this vision of leading with racial equity, which was adopted by our state board just a few years ago. And so we're still trying to practice what that looks like, to embody it, to weave it and embed it throughout all of our practices and policies in the way that we show up to this work with our students, faculty, and staff. And part of that work really is asking the question, where does the work of sustainability and climate solutions live in this system and in this ecosystem? Oftentimes we find it living in facilities and operations, but what does it look like to more intentionally weave together this work across equity, across our education division, across IT, and all the spaces where folks are providing leadership so that there's no educational endeavor that does not include climate solutions. Next slide, please. So in that role, we realize and recognize that racism permeates across, right, within our communities, industries, organizations, structures, even within higher education. And so our role really is to name these inequitable structures, but also to provide solutions, thought partnership on what that looks like to begin to really imagine together, right, radically imagine together what it could look like if we lived in a world and lived and taught and went to school in spaces where those inequitable structures are acknowledged and that we are actively together trying to dismantle them. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to start off with this quote from Grace Lee Boggs, only because I think that, we might not view these climate action plans as narrative building, but I think that every time we put something out into the world, we know that it's data, it's information, but it's also an invitation about how we could be, right? And we know that what we experience in this world is far from the world that we know can be, right? Where folks are not just living, but we're thriving, right? And not just people, but like all of our kin. And so this quote from Grace Lee Boggs, I think, is an invitation to think about how through climate action plans, right, something that we might seem as technical is also a way to narrate change. And so she says, people are aware that they cannot continue in the same old way, but are immobilized because they cannot imagine an alternative. And so we need a vision that recognizes that we are at one of the great turning points in human history, where the survival of our planet and the restoration of our humanity require great sea change in our ecological, economic, political, and spiritual values. And so for me, that is an invitation through climate action plans, through all the ways that we show up to this work and the ways that we embed equity and anti-racism in it, whether super explicitly, right? Because I acknowledge that we don't all live in states where we have legislative support for this work. I spent the last 10 years in Tennessee, and so I know what it looks, sounds, and feels like to be to have this work actively being dismantled and renamed as something else, right? And so what does that look like even in those spaces? Because we know, as was shown in the polls, that this work is really important. Next slide, please. Okay, so what I'm going to offer to us to kind of kick off this conversation is an invitation to explore like a framework or a lens as we think about equitable decision making. And I think that even if you are further along in your climate action planning process, or you're almost done, or maybe you're in the process of revising after being in place for a few years, that there's still these lenses that we can apply to ask, what more can we do? Who else can we be in conversation with? And who else's voices, experiences might be centered in ways that they haven't been before. So this invitation to equitable decision-making, three things. This is not exhaustive, and you all probably have more, which you're welcome to drop in the chat. But for me, I think it's the invitation to pause, to deeply listen, and then to reflect, right? Because when we know better, there's the hope that we then do better. So what could that look like through these climate action plans, through equitable community engagement, so that those who are experiencing the most impact are also have a seat in these spaces where decisions are being made, not just on their behalf, but alongside. The second is to imagine what's possible, right? And I think oftentimes we don't always leave space for the radical imagining that could happen. And, the work of Adrienne Lee Brown and other kind of Afrofuturists, and others, Octavia Butler, who talk about the need for radical imagination, right? And so what could it look like if we paused, not just at the beginning, but throughout, right? And even after our climate action plans are done, to imagine what is possible, so that we disrupt existing processes and trajectories, so that what might have been done before is not necessarily the path that we need to take now. And then the third is to just be intentional and thoughtful about our actions, right? So yes, we have timelines and scope of work and budgets and all those things, but what could it look like if we took the extra necessary time to really be intentional about the questions that we're asking, the pieces that we're putting into these climate action plans, and know that at the end of it, when someone takes a look at it, they can see the thought and the intentionality put behind what we end up producing and sharing out into the world. Okay, so this is not my work, but this is definitely a framework that I have used and have kind of brought together with some other existing resources. So I am not great at thinking about acronyms, so I didn't think about this one, but it's something easy to remember, right? So VIBE. So do a vibe check as you're going throughout this planning process. And VIBE just stands for views, inclusion, benefits and burdens, and then equity. So as we think about the V for vibe, right, what are the views that we are taking into consideration? Whose views are being centered, whose are not, who's being left out of the conversation, right? When we look around the room, do we represent those who might most be impacted by the decisions that are being made? And how could inclusion of those views and voices really shift the ways that we co-create something together? Next slide, please. So the I for vibe is inclusion, right? So who should be consulted as we think about and understand the implications of our decisions all throughout the process? Again, who is included, who's engaged? Example, those who are potentially impacted or most impacted by these decisions, right? Were they a part of this conversation at all? And I think specifically, not necessarily climate example, but we are a state who has legislative support to do diversity, equity, inclusion work. And when what is now law was in the legislature, our diversity officers were not a part of those conversations, but now are the ones responsible for the mandates in the legislation, which are now law, right? So how do we ensure that those who will be the ones to either have the most impact or burden about a decision and the ones to maybe be responsible for carrying those out are included and can inform what it is we say is important and how we form our climate action plans. And not just to be included, but how to ask, right? And to invite, how would you like to be included in this process? And I think that's very different than inviting someone to a meeting and to say, like, how would you like to be engaged in this process, right? Or who else would you like to bring to this conversation? And then the third is, have I taken the necessary time to hear and thoughtfully consider this folks' stated needs, right? Not just what we assume about a particular community or individuals, but what they have actually said to us, right? And can we receive that information and trust that we are receiving this information from communities that are very much invested in this work, right? That we don't just call on them because we need to check the box, that we made an attempt to engage different communities, right? Okay. All right. And then has adequate time been given to meaningfully incorporate these voices? Okay, next slide. So benefits and burdens, who will benefit most from this decision, right? These are all questions that I hope have been asked along the way. And if not, it's not too late, right? So I think for me, one of the questions to really consider is, will those who are furthest from justice, those who are furthest from this process, be the ones who are also then more responsible for carrying it out or being most impacted by it, right? And then back to this idea that if we know better, we do better. Do we have a plan to address or mitigate what has been surfaced in these processes? Okay, and then the last E for the slide is equity. And if you can turn it to the next one, thank you. So again, will this decision ultimately lead to a more equitable environment? Will it exacerbate any inequities that already exist? And again, do we have a plan to address those things later? And how am I using my power and positionality to enact change that we know will have deeper impact? So that's sort of the vibe check. And then I just want to end with a slide just of questions for you all to consider. And so you can screenshot this as you think about these questions later. But how are we moving, from independence, right, toward more interdependence? How do we think about mutual reliance, shared vision, and leadership, and who we are in relationship with? And the second question really is, like, what does this work look like in states that we know don't have these climate commitments that other states in the country do? And so what could that look like as we continue to share best practices, promising practices, and what has worked, maybe what hasn't, but could potentially work in another space? Do I have another slide after this? Okay, so lastly, going to leave you with some Adrienne Maree Brown, and that is, part of the emergent strategies kind of series is this idea that what we pay attention to grows, right? And so how do we kind of shore up all of our hopes, dreams, realities, and radical imagining to be able to cast a vision through something like a climate action plan for a future that we know is very different from our reality, but know can exist. And I'll quote Leah Thomas, intersectional environmentalist, and end there to say that, can we, and I hope the answer is yes, really help to create spaces where creation can not only survive, but thrive in liberation and joy. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophia. I know that went by really quickly. The 10 minutes always goes by way faster than you think. So we appreciate you. So I'm going to bring on our next panelist, which is Ileana Ortega Brunetti. And Ileana is the Assistant Director of Sustainability for Equity and Co-Curricular Programs at UC Santa Cruz. Currently, Ileana co-chairs the UC Office of the President, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice Sustainability Officers Working Group. On campus, she co-directs the People of Color Sustainability Collective and supervises the Student Sustainability and Environmental Justice Ambassadors team, where she encourages students to learn about and find their place in promoting inclusive environmental well-being. Ileana also leads UCSC's community work in Pajaro Valley through a state grant that supports community-led and participatory research in developing local climate resilience projects. Prior to UCSC, she worked extensively in the region's nonprofit sector. She has held various leadership positions working in environmental conservation, education, and social and economic justice. She received her BA in communication from UC Santa Barbara and holds 2 master's degrees from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in international environmental policy and business administration with a concentration in finance. She also serves on the boards of Ecology Action and Bay Federal Credit Union. Welcome, Ileana, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Cami. Oh my gosh, I can't believe that everything you said about me is all true. It sounds a little like too much and a little bit like a dream, but I guess that's what happens when we pursue our dreams very, very actively. Opportunities come to us, and we have chances to impact and embed our perspectives in our communities in ways that I cannot imagine. And I think that's kind of an important process of my story and my being here with you all today. So, as Cami mentioned, my work varies across a lot of uh, impact levels. And today I'm going to talk to you about what we did for our just transition and equity analysis. So next slide, please. UC system indicated a mandate amongst our UC locations. We say UC locations instead of UC campuses because there are health center locations. There are research laboratories that also come into play in this landscape beyond just campuses. So I will use UC locations in a very intentional way. But on our campus, our chancellor indicated that she had a 5-year plan with 5 core pillars. And as you can see, one of the core pillars was climate change, sustainability, and resilience. So next slide, please. So with that, we had a mandate as the sustainability office on our campus to really think about what does inclusive sustainability mean at UC Santa Cruz, and how do we identify and rally and talk about inclusive sustainability at the campus level, not necessarily the UC system level, but just what's happening on our campus, what's happening on our community, and how does our community think and feel about inclusive sustainability. Next slide, please. And to that end, we formed the People of Color Sustainability Collective. This was really kind of an organic conversation that happened when one undergraduate student put their trash receptacle in what sustainability office student employee deemed as quote unquote inappropriate. Like, why are you putting a level 5 recycling container in the landfill when it can be going into a recycling container, right? And so that kind of sparked conversation in between various different offices. And we really took a hard look at, like, what does sustainability mean? Not just across landfill and waste use, but what does it mean culturally? What does it mean linguistically? What does it mean for first generation students? What does it mean for, white students? Like, how do we dice this up along a lot of different variables, right? And so then in 2015, that ended up in the People of Color Sustainability Collective, or the POCSC, coining the term inclusive sustainability. And in that sense, through that conversation and through that kind of spark of ideation, we decided that inclusive sustainability is something that really disrupts the idea that the university and formally educated people are the gatekeepers of knowledge, right? So, like, writ large in socialistic, not socialistic, but like a settlerism, white colonialistic perspective, it is the European centers and what's come to us through, like, Teddy Roosevelt and those kind of well-named John Muir type of environmentalists have defined environmentalism, which just means that you're formally educated in environmentalism. You are the gatekeepers of knowledge. You say, this is how we're going to preserve a national park. This is how we're going to preserve a national multi-million acre state of federal lands for conservation. So we challenge that. And we also challenge and acknowledge the efforts made by people of color to advance sustainability. Like, what does it mean if you take, say, your pasta container from Costco and reuse that to put in your beans or your rice or your whole grain wheats, right? Like, what does reuse mean and how does that play into things in the broad scale of how we define sustainability? It also recognizes that many sustainability efforts have historically ignored and discriminated these communities of color. So it's not that, you know, one is right or one is wrong. It's just there are different ways of approaching and thinking about sustainability, and where one may see themselves very clearly defined as like, I'm a sustainability warrior versus like, I'm just putting things in these reusable containers. I'm just riding the bus because that's what I have to do because of my economic constraints. And we're kind of being like the Oprahs here saying, congratulations, you're a sustainability warrior, you're a sustainability warrior, and you're a sustainability warrior. And it doesn't matter if it's like that you're riding the bus or that you're buying EV vehicles or that you're concerned about polar bears or that you're concerned about Chevron building a new chemical plant in your community, right? It's just like, it's that advocacy, that shared advocacy work that makes you a sustainability warrior. And so we're really trying to like uplift and acknowledge that. Um, and then the other thing is that we realize, based on these different perspectives of how we approach sustainability and environmental justice, that it's very much based on cultural approaches. It's very much based on linguistics approaches or environmental approaches. And so there's, in essence, this like intersectional and intersectional and interdisciplinary approach to how we think and talk about environmental conservation. And it's just not EV fighting for polar bears, wearing Patagonia. It can also be riding the bus, bringing your errands bag, not, bringing reusable things into your lifestyle, that there is a broader definition for environmental conservation. Next slide, please. And to this end, in our office, here are, I think we can skip this because I've kind of already covered this, like, right? It's not about saving the polar ozones. It's not about what we would traditionally consider environmental conservation rights, like the XL pipeline, right? It's about what's happening in our community and how can we advocate against big business or for big business in a way that feels right and comfortable for our local communities, whether they're affluent communities or whether they're communities of color, because research has shown that there's a stark difference between each of those approaches. But anyway, what we've done at UCSC that I think is very unique is that we've attended, we've called for a mandate for our sustainability office to attend meetings and events that are outside our typical scope of work. And that includes like, hey, if there's flooding in our community, which has happened in the last couple of years, if there is climate change related flooding in our community, how do we show up for this immigrant community that's traditionally more low income, more immigrant, more indigenous? And how do we use our research power to create advocacy and voice for this community, right? How do we look at how we define and promote our programs around sustainability across our campus related to our mission statement? So to that end, as I've kind of mentioned before, we co-direct the People of Color Sustainability Collective, which is in partnership with our American Indian Ethnic Resource Center and our John R. Lewis College, as well as our College 9 Center for like social transformation. We've developed core partnerships across our ethnic resource centers to include LGBTQIA, as well as other climate groups across campus, including our Rachel Carson College. We also evaluate kind of the programming and events that we host in our office around what can and cannot be considered climate resilient climate advocacy groups. My position as an assistant director or co-director for the sustainability office that focuses specifically on equity and co-curricular program partnerships across campus within our community and across the UC system is a great starting point for that as well. And then we also think about how can we contribute to our UC system-wide level conversations around what is equity? How do we think about equity? What can we report on as equity, right? So there's a lot of layers to this work, and it's not necessarily clear cut and dry, but it's definitely trying to advance everyone to like explore what we call our learning edges, right? How do we go to that forefront where we might feel a little bit uncomfortable and where we might feel a little like this is really pushing the boundary? And then how do we marry all of these stages together at once? And one of those examples is the 2024 Equity and Just Transition analysis that we conducted. So moving on to the next couple slides. I see I have just a couple minutes. We developed a system-wide consultant that could kind of coalesce all of this information for us. So we can go on to the next slide. And some of those equity indicators included for us several things. So on UCSC campus specifically, you see here a list of targeted and focused engagement that we conducted around a just transition and equity analysis based on our decarbonization and electrification efforts. So this was just like a subset of a subset of a subset of focused work. And when you drill that far down, you can see that within like 5 to 6 months, there were over 20 plus meetings with different stakeholders and different groups. And that's because we really felt it was important to get everybody's voice and opinions and priorities into this report and to reflect that back to the community to say, hey, yeah, we went out and we talked to the stakeholders that we thought were going to be most impacted by this work. Next slide. And then the work that we kind of came out of that with was we framed this within, and this is with leadership buy-in. We said, we showed in this exact slide, and we said, if you were to think about how much ownership and how much power a community has to dictate what can happen and how we move forward with things, where would that land with you? And our campus leadership unanimously chose like in between 2 and 3. So that was one of the things that we were very clear to speak to with our constituents is we said, hey, look, leadership is here. We're talking about this now because we care about what you think. We want you to make us think differently about this issue, and we want you to identify maybe different variables that leadership would not necessarily consider because they're not in the day-to-day of the work that you're in, right? And we want that feedback. And based on that feedback, leadership will decide what happens at a broad scale trajectory for our campus. But we cannot decide what will be incorporated and what will not be incorporated. So there was at the very onset this kind of sense of transparency about where power was, who held the power, to what extent the voice of the people would be incorporated into the decision-making process and what we could promise, right? And that made a really big difference in terms of building trust and credibility. Next slide, please. And with that information that we gathered from all of those listening sessions, we decided to break down our preliminary analysis into some like case studies where we said, here are some institutional values that we hold very highly in regard and that we want to make sure we carry forward and that we want to validate and that we want to pursue into the incoming years, right? So we have like case study 1, which is gas pipelines and building infrastructure and research. And then what you have in parentheses are the institutional values and commitments that we've already agreed to that this would impact so that we can tie like from front to back the conversations with the on the ground folks to our institutional values and that we can say to leadership, hey, this conversation, this case study ties concretely from A to Z. and here's where, and here's how. Next slide, please. So then, yeah, these are some indicators that we used. Next slide, please. Currently, we are conducting an equity and impact analysis worksheet to integrate equity into our decision-making process as a division. We're continuing to build on the data that we collected through these case studies, and we're strengthening stakeholder and thought partnership in these areas. And the reason why I show this picture here is because one of the things that we noticed in our just transition and equity analysis was that some of our specialty and trade shop workers were being left out of this conversation. So this is an image of the work that our HVAC technicians do on behalf of our campus and bring to building our campus. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, Ileana, I wasn't trying to push you out. We just want to make sure we get Briar in here.
Yes,
For
agreed.
folks that do have questions for Ileana, her email is listed here. I think you have some great examples of how to embed equity a little bit more. So, and everybody will come back on screen, and we'll have just a couple minutes for Q&A at the end too. So I'm going to pass it. Thank you again, Ileana, and I'm going to pass it to Briar Ray, who is, let me go to your first slide. Briar Ray is from Portland Community College, and she is the Associate Dean for Sustainability with the focus of mainstreaming sustainability across the college and implementing PCC's Climate Action Plan. She has taught sustainability courses at PCC and sat on the board of directors for the Greater Portland Sustainability Education Network for 7 years. She holds a master's degree in sustainability from Arizona State, as well as a BA in sustainability and a BS in justice studies. She received her LEED Green Associate and Master Gardener certification in 2016, and she has represented the college at the local, national, and international level, including at the UN Climate Change Conference in Bonn, Germany. She is also a co-organizer for the annual Washington, Oregon Higher Ed Sustainability Conference, and she likes to spend her free time crafting, gardening, and spending time with her loved ones. So Briar, I will hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Cami. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for spending time with us today. I am going to try my best to get through this quickly, so I may talk a little fast, but happy to connect with folks one-on-one after this as well to answer any questions or go into depth that I can't cover today. So again, I'm Briar Ray. I use she and her pronouns. I'm the Associate Dean for Sustainability Strategies at Portland Community College, and I've been with PCC for almost 12 years now. Next slide, please. Thanks, Cami. I'd like to begin my portion of the presentation by acknowledging the original stewards and caretakers of the land where I sit and come to you today. PCC rests on the traditional village sites of Multnomah, Cathlamet, and Clackamas bands of the Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. Multnomah is a band of Chinooks that lived in this area. I want to note that our intent with this land acknowledgement is to name the history of the land we occupy, and by doing so, bring attention to the many different ways communities have arrived to this area and how this history has shaped the current climate emergency. We acknowledge that this is stolen land that has been degraded by people of colonial cultures and practices, and that PCC must address colonialism to work towards climate justice. Next slide, please. And just a little bit of context for those who might not be familiar with PCC. The college opened in 1961. We're among one of the largest institutions of higher education in Oregon. We also have a significant footprint. We operate out of 4 campuses and 10 centers, serving 5 counties in Oregon. And these are really in geographically diverse locations, each have very unique needs. These facilities collectively measure 2.6 million square feet, sitting over 500 plus acres. PCC is also historically one of the most racially and ethnically diverse institutions in Oregon. In addition, many of our students face economic related barriers as well as food and housing insecurity. So all of these factors play a role in our programming for sustainability and our various climate action efforts. Also, I just want to note too, here on the screen is our mission at PCC, that's on the right. And you can see here that both sustainability and diversity, equity, and inclusion are identified in our college mission as core themes. Next slide. And we're really proud to say that sustainability is truly at the core of what we do as an institution. We've worked hard to weave this throughout operations, academics, and student life. In the interest of time, I won't dive into any of these, but I did just want to demonstrate the breadth of programming we have and how collaborative this effort truly is, and that this has contributed to the college continually being acknowledged as a top performer among community colleges that report to ESHE stars. Next slide. Great. So now I'll transition to the main topic for today, talking a bit more about our climate action plan update process. So our current climate action plan, this is our third iteration, and we began this latest update in early 2020. We worked with the Boston-based firm Greener U on this update, and you can see up here on the screen, the overall goals of this CAP update were to update the CAP with the addition of a resiliency section, center equity throughout the entire process, foster inclusive stakeholder engagement, use science-based targets to create actionable steps towards greenhouse gas mitigation, and align with previous and ongoing campus planning efforts, as well as broader community initiatives. Next slide. Early on, we developed a vision and mission statement for the updated CAP. This is really to help guide the process, and we developed it through multiple rounds of community input and feedback. So the vision statement, PCC envisions an equity-focused transition to a resilient, thriving society with net zero greenhouse gas emissions that addresses historical injustices through education and empowering a diverse community to engage in climate action. And the mission statement, just how we really get there, PCC provides climate education, green workforce development, carbon neutral operations, and advances collective action to confront the global climate crisis in support of a just transition. Next slide. We also developed a set of value statements to help us align climate action with PCC's mission. These were also developed by our CAP Update Task Force and helped the working groups define criteria for their strategies and ensure a support for climate justice. For the sake of time, I won't read these, but I did want to acknowledge them. Next slide. And now I'll dive into the process a bit more. So really from the very beginning, we wanted to establish a framework and process to ensure that our planning and CAP goals supported local and regional equity efforts and advanced climate justice principles. So looking first at the teal circle up here, you can see how we framed equity and climate justice within the planning process early on. And that was by acknowledging the role environmental racism and inequitable funding of climate solutions plays in today's existing conditions for marginalized communities, by prioritizing historically underserved and oppressed voices in the decision-making process, by supporting students and having a voice in the regional discussion on climate change and resiliency, by addressing how risks from climate change impact equitable student success, and by supporting place-based equity. And then I'll talk a little bit more about how we kind of operationalize all of this moving forward. Next slide, thank you. So one of the ways we were intentional in centering equity from the very beginning included calling it out specifically in our request for proposals for climate action planning services. So we identified equity and climate justice as a core outcome in the project overview, the description of required services, and deliverables, including stakeholder engagement and the selection of mitigation strategies. We also identified points in the award criteria for firms with experience centering equity in planning processes, which we hoped would encourage firms with strong commitments and experience working in DEI to apply. And just wanted to note that our RFP is now being used as a model both internally and externally for supporting equitable processes in procurement. Next slide. We, in regards to stakeholder engagement, we began planning before the onset of the pandemic and then had to pivot rapidly to remote operations really early on. So we did our best to keep moving forward and develop new ways to engage that were both equitable and inclusive while recognizing that it was a very heavy time and not everyone may have the energy or the capacity to really participate fully. The engagement opportunities that we did use included launching an online survey and sending out multiple emails, personal invitations, social media blasts to promote participation. We coordinated with faculty to have a climate action plan assignment included in online class modules to improve student engagement and feedback. We hosted so many listening sessions. Some were with targeted audiences like our identity-based equity centers and student leaders, and many others that were open to anyone from the college. We also established a CAP task force of 80+ people. We also met regularly with that group, but then also had individual focus area meetings where additional folks were pulled in given their role at the college and expertise. I also want to acknowledge that we held throughout this whole process regular check-ins with our Office of Equity and Inclusion at the college and had 2 members from that team, from that office on our task force. And then we also included community partners focused on environmental justice in the task force as well. Next slide. Something we borrowed from Multnomah County's planning process is the use of an equity evaluator in our stakeholder engagement. So during our listening sessions, we had someone identified as the evaluator whose sole role was to be present with a focus on calling out any unintended consequences that prevent equity and inclusion. For example, biases that are showing up in the process, folks being overlooked when trying to share or speak, keeping an eye on the chat box, and looking for raised hands, among other things. The evaluator also spoke up if an idea was being advanced that could unintentionally cause harm. Next slide. Now I'd like to share a little bit about our CAP equity guide. So at PCC, as part of our college's planning process, we are encouraged to utilize tools that help us to take time to pause and reflect on intention, identities, and beneficiaries of proposed actions, with the ultimate goal of centering racial equity and social justice in our process and planning. So to support this, we designed a climate action equity guide to infuse equity throughout the climate action planning process across 5 Ps: purpose, power, place, process, and people. And this framework draws from critical race theory, from Multnomah County's Equity and Empowerment Lens, and the City of Portland, Oregon's Climate Action Plan equity considerations. Each P has an overarching question, which highlights the intent with many sub-questions to help reflect and answer the overarching question while focusing on equity. And it's important to note that while there are many questions to help us think through our process goals and strategies, this is certainly not a checklist. We are not focused on checking boxes, and there may be more questions that we need to ask. Next slide. In the interest of time, I won't dig into this one, but just wanted to show you an example of one of the Ps and the associated questions that we utilize to think through. Up here is power. Next slide. One back, please. Almost finished. Okay, so we also utilize tools from our Office of Equity Inclusion Take 5 Toolkit. So these resources are a result of the college's work to really create intentional ways to make equity a part of our everyday learning and work here at PCC. One tool is identity cards, which you see here on the right. And these cards just serve as a reminder to think about how different folks may be impacted by the decisions we make in our planning process and how our actions might be modified to better benefit our diverse PCC community. So you can use these cards by talking through potential impacts, burdens, and benefits per identity group, or whose voice is missing as you work through the decision-making process. This is just a sample of the cards, and it is by no means a comprehensive list. Another process we use is Fist of 5 voting. So Fist of 5 is an inclusive decision-making process to ensure there is consensus on a decision before moving forward. So everyone has to share their vote, and this ensures that every voice is heard. If there are 0 to 2 votes, we must resolve the issues before I move forward with the proposal. I also just want to note that we hosted lots of equity trainings that included pre-reading homework, presentations, group discussions. We also practiced using these tools and our equity guide prior to fully developing the goals and strategies of the climate action plan so that we ensured everyone had a baseline understanding and that we could continue to build off that foundation. And then last but not least, I just wanted to show kind of an example. I know this was about process, but how this ended up influencing a sample goal and associated strategies. So looking at education and outreach, goal 1, by 2026, all students are supported and encouraged to engage with sustainability and climate justice education through student-centered curricular and co-curricular offerings that are equity conscious. And looking at 1.3 strategy, ensure all sustainability and climate justice curricular offerings are culturally responsive and support anti-racist pedagogies. So some of the actions we plan and are taking in regards to this one is broad collaboration with community organizations, as well as partnering with our Office of Equity Inclusion and multicultural centers on faculty training, accumulating resources on decolonizing sustainability curriculum, and broadening representation in course materials by centering the voices and efforts of BIPOC folks. All right, sorry, I know that was really quick, but happy to answer any questions folks have. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Briar. And I know it felt very rushed, and I was reflecting maybe we should have had this be a 90-minute webinar instead of 60 minutes. But if folks want to come back on camera, and I will stop sharing my screen. So we have a couple questions in here, and just the FYI, we did with your guys' burning questions. We tried to embed some of those in the presentation. So, but if those weren't answered, because there were close to 40 of them, you know, please feel free to reach out to the panelists, and maybe y'all, if you want to put your emails in the chat, that would be helpful. So when we're talking, we don't have to pull the screen back up to see your emails. But one thing I just wanted to ask, and Andy had asked it earlier, but I think it's a really good question that I think should be brought up. And he asked, how do you recommend following up with established campus organizations that are dedicated to equity, that have been invited to provide input, but they haven't responded? They said the offer was out there, but we didn't get a response, feels insufficient, but there isn't a way to equitably follow up with all of the relevant groups. And so I just want to kind of voice what Sophia and Breyer had said, and Ileana, you're welcome to respond as well. But generally what I feel like was said was it's about relationship building. And if those relationships kind of were not established before you came with them for an ask, that really the pivot needs to be on focusing on that relationship with those specific organizations. Would you, Sophia, agree with that? And then maybe Ileana can chime in as well, and Breyer.
Yeah, you know, thinking about the relationships that we have, existing relationships that we want to build before there's any sort of ask, whether it's around communication and storytelling or around, right, being able to provide input, I think is really important. And it's, again, none of this is ever too late, right? So I think even if we're already, you know, further down the line in a process, that it's not too late to begin to build those relationships, so that the next time there's an ask, the next time there's another process that we want to engage folks, that we have made the attempts to equitably engage folks. And I would include in that, right, like the tribes that we have in our areas and regions, and they are not stakeholders, right? They are partners. Many of our tribes, again, have been stewards of this work since time immemorial. And so what does it look like to both lean on, right, the expertise and the wisdom, as well as seek to build relationships for this purpose of building relationships and mutual understanding and support of one another.
Thanks, Sophia. Ileana, did you want to add anything to that? Maybe we'll stay on a couple extra minutes for folks that have the time, and if you guys have the time to answer additional questions.
I can say I have the time to answer additional questions, and that one of the things that we did is we started with who, based on what we know about campus and campus engagement and campus connections, like who is in our immediate circle. And then let's dig one level deeper, right? Let's ask those people that we're talking to, who else should we be talking to? And that was really helpful in terms of discovering new opportunities, new stakeholders, new voices, new perspectives to bring into this conversation and to consider as important stakeholders to this conversation.
Great, thanks, Ileana. And Samuel said he's struggling, or they're struggling at a private university. It doesn't feel like they can afford to invest in sustainability. And sorry, I just lost. Okay. And I feel like they cannot afford to, for a lot of reasons. Is this issue in making it inclusive help with enrollment and retention? Is there data on this? And Sophia, you responded with your email around narrative building and how they're not separate. But Breyer and Ileana, do you want to respond to that as well? And then we can close out.
Yeah, so in our office, we have an IREPS office that's like the institutional research office for academics. And anyways, they kind of pull together data for our incoming freshmen, our faculty, all of that stuff. So we can rely on them to kind of help us navigate some of these data questions. And in addition to that, as I mentioned, we're also developing this kind of equity impact analysis worksheet where we frame out for people very specifically at various stages of construction or programmatic level level of inquiry, like, right, what kind of questions do you need to make sure that you're answering for yourself and that you have clear for yourself about what the equity indicators are for these outcomes. Um, so it's not necessarily like saying you're doing a good job or you're doing a bad job, but it's just like, hey, here's where we are as an institution. Here's where our values are, and here's how we're supporting them, or here's how we're misaligning with them, right? So that just everyone has that transparency in the processes and can work through that and have those conversations around that. And I'd be happy to share that that worksheet with anyone that would.
Yeah, I think that would be great. We can share that with our follow-up email. I think that would be really helpful for folks. Any other thing to add, and then we'll close out with our quick time.
The only thing, quickly, great points already made, but in addition, we're focusing a lot of our efforts now around addressing climate anxiety, eco-anxiety that our students are facing. And there's a lot of national research that shows that, 3/4 of youth are concerned or very concerned. Some, don't even feel that they have a future worth pursuing. And so that demonstrates how important this topic is to a lot of incoming students. And when we work with our students around this topic, we're seeing similar rates of concern and despair as well. And, acknowledging how the climate crisis impacts folks so inequitably, and those that have contributed the least, continue to carry the most burdens. We know this, tying that all into how this is important, I think can help start that conversation, or maybe even just going to your student groups and, asking them, and maybe they go to the board of directors. That's how we first got our initiative kind of embedded into the college mission statement. And so, engaging with your students, find out what they care about, having them go to leadership, that's always helpful as well. My two-minute answer.
Yeah, that's great. Sophia, Ileana, anything to add to that?
One of the things that we're starting to do here at our agency is these wayfinding circles to help surface these feelings, anxieties, just thoughts, and to hold space for conversation about what this work looks like, even if you don't have a work that you believe is explicitly tied to climate solutions. And so how do we create those spaces where people can just come and be like, I'm new to this. What are we doing here?
Yeah, great suggestions.
Yeah, and I think as a closing point, I would just add that I recognize that we on the West Coast are very privileged to have like support from leadership or embedded support from leadership about what our work entails and what it means. And that I would encourage those folks, because I've heard from our own ODI, Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion offices, that this is not the case across the country. And that just to keep in mind that office like equity, inclusion, and diversity does not necessarily tie to race and socioeconomic status or immigration status, right? There is a whole bunch of other variables through which we can examine this lens. And so if these lenses don't make sense for you and your campus and your university, you can look at socioeconomic status or like the actual skilled trades work that's being done. And that's one of the things that we did at UCSC is like our skilled tradesmen, even though they're white middle class men predominantly, they were being left out of this conversation. They were left being out of our photos. They were being left out of like how this campus operates. So there's other ways in which you can classify inclusion, equity, and diversity. It does not have to be racially based. It does not have to be gender based. It does not have to be socioeconomic based. Just look at what your community needs and what makes sense for them. And that can lead you into great opportunities and into conversations that are really maybe difficult, provide great opportunities for your community writ large.
Great points. Thanks, Ileana. All right. Well, thanks for folks that are still with us. We appreciate everybody being here. And again, I want to say thank you to Sophia, Breyer, and Ileana for their time and wisdom that they shared with us. Obviously, this is a This is not an hour conversation. This is a lifelong conversation. So we appreciate everyone that's here. And yeah, we hope you guys have a good rest of your day. Thanks.